and welcome back to Open Up the Industry with CoolerNathi. In this episode, we're chatting to Terry Khoza. Terry shares with us her journey from being told she's not competent enough to be a pilot to becoming a pilot. She shares the challenges she endured and how she chose to overcome them. This is the story of a young woman who became a flight commander when the world said she would not be competent enough to do so. If it's inspiration you need, then Terry has it in truckloads. So let's. Hello, Terry.
Well, hi, Khoza.
Thank you so much for joining us here on CoolerNathi. It's such an absolute pleasure to have you.
You're most welcome. I'm so honored to actually be here. I'm glad you actually invited me.
Great. Okay, so before we get into your very exciting career, let's talk about Terry Khoza. Who is Terry Khoza? What are you about? Where were you born? Where are you from?
Well, Terry being my third name, actually my first name is Balesa, but I do prefer to go by Terry. Terry was born in Johannesburg, 1990. I actually grew up in the south of Johannesburg. Went to primary school in the south of Johannesburg called Rosettenville Central. And I went to high school in Queens High. University, I did a bit of engineering. That didn't go on for very long. And then I decided to change that and move on to aviation. So I'm a lively, outgoing person. I enjoy the outdoors. That's basically who Terry is. Okay,
wonderful. So tell us, how exactly did you get into flying?
So apparently, as rumors would have it, that my family says that as early as 5 years of age, I kept saying I wanted to be a pilot. So I remember, I think I was, what I can remember, I think I was about 7 years old when I was at the airport for the first time, and I saw a 747. I didn't know what it was at the time, taking off, and I was in awe. I was
exposure,
shocked. Exactly. Exposure goes a long way, and exposure at a very early age makes the biggest difference. When I said to myself, I want to understand why that thing is able to actually be in the sky. How can something that big, I mean, it's bigger than a bus. How can something that massive actually get off the ground and continue flying? And that's when my interest actually started, and from there, family from all directions, my grandmother, my mother were just on it, where they were just like, okay, you said you wanted to be a pilot, let's keep it going.
But
and funny enough,
thing to have that.
Yeah, it is. I think it's an amazing thing. And funny enough, you find a lot of kids from an early age, they initially say they want to be a pilot, then it's a doctor, then it's a teacher. For me, it's just always been a pilot. I don't think I've ever been in a phase where I didn't want to be a pilot. And like I mentioned earlier, the engineering thing was a stepping stone rather than saying I want to be an engineer.
Oh, okay.
It was more like a
Yeah.
backup plan. So in the aviation industry, you get a license. However, there's so many factors that affect your ability to continue flying, which mostly relate to your medical history. So my concern was, if I become a pilot without having a backup plan, which was in my case engineering, what if I find myself in an environment where I get grounded as a result of failed medical exam, whatever the case might be. So when I chose to get into engineering in high school, it was literally as a case where in the event, in the long term, I discover that I'm not actually medically fit, then I can always go back into engineering and actually
so you were thinking long
work.
term.
Yes, I really was. No, like I'm saying, I've always just wanted to be a pilot, and I started aeronautical engineering, but I discovered bursaries were almost impossible to find, so that's when I fell back onto mechanical engineering. And as time progressed, I realized that this is not my passion. It's not where I wanted to be, and that's when I decided I'm going to pull away and just be completely devoted to the aviation industry.
Okay, amazing. Terry, what does it actually take to get into aviation? What are the requirements?
So to get into a flight school, which is usually the process, the stepping stone, you don't really need all that much. It turns out that you could actually start flying from as early as the age of 9. However, your license you can only obtain at the age of 16. So you can go on your initial solo flight at the age of 16, because the process is that you start your training and then you have to do an initial solo flight where you're flying alone without an instructor in the cockpit with you. And then once you turn 17, then you're able to get what is known as your private pilot's license, which is this brown book that I have over here. So basically what it takes, I guess, is determination and passion more than anything. Because if you're really not interested in it, you're not going to stay the long haul. So there's 8 subjects that you do in the initial phases before you get your private pilot's license.
Let's go back. Starting with so from 9, how do you do that? I don't want 9-year-olds going to like, I want to be a pilot, take me. I need to go on my flight now.
So basically, the whole process is like with driving a car. Get into the car and you practice how to drive.
Okay.
So with an aircraft, you constantly have somebody sitting with you as the instructor on the right-hand seat.
Okay.
So the student sits on the left and the pilot sits on the right. So obviously, if you're not tall enough, then it becomes a challenge. But I mean, you get very tall 9-year-olds who are able to sit within the cockpit. So the whole point is to be able to get a feel of the aircraft and to practice, because it is a long journey. It's not as quick as, I don't know, I don't think any career is actually quick, but it's genuinely a very long journey that you can go through. So the earlier the better, actually. I would recommend anybody who wants to become a pilot to start flying at an earlier age. Yeah. So for me, I started my flight training, I was 24 when I started flight training. But I discovered along the way that I could have actually started flying at the age of 16, which would have, you know, given me a better head start in terms of actually eventually getting into the airline or my hours or whatever the case might be. So like I'm saying, you don't really need that many requirements. Aptitude is a very important thing, however, in terms of your maths and your science. And only
so what have you
once
got to get? Like, I mean,
you pass your result, you'd preferably want to get a B or an A in maths and science. However, that's more required within the airline. Once you actually your license, which is the commercial pilot's license, which follows the private pilot's license. That's when you actually want to apply into an airline, and that's where they really focus on your marks and your result. But in the early stages, if you have the funding as well, because that's another big factor, very, very big issue. If you have the fund, then you are able to put yourself into flight school. You can fly as leisurely as you like, and that's where the private pilot's license comes. So you find that within the aviation industry, you have general aviation, which includes the instructional phase, as well as the phase where people are flying for the fun of it, where they get themselves a private pilot's license and they get their own aircrafts and they choose to fly at their own leisure. And then once the private pilot phase is over, you move on to your commercial pilot's license. Now, the importance of the commercial pilot's license, which is the license that enables you to eventually get into an airline, is that you go into depth in terms of your training. So they give you information and knowledge about larger aircrafts, as well as the instruments that you require to be able to understand how to fly the larger aircraft. However, and this is where it becomes very tricky, once you have your blue book, as I spoke about in my blog, there's a huge gap between having that blue book and getting into an airline. And that's where I think being an instructor for the past couple of years, 3 years now, wow.
And that's the expensive part,
that's the whole thing is expensive actually, from the beginning to the end. So it becomes less expensive once you have your blue book, because you can easily go into instruction where you become the teacher, whereas before you were the one getting taught. So once you have the blue book, you become an instructor, and you use that as a means or a stepping stone to accumulate the hours. It's got a lot of practice. It's brilliant because you get exposed to the environment from a different perspective, whereas as a student you're constantly getting taught, and it's a lot of information constantly, and the industry is always growing, so there's constant information that comes at you. So as an instructor, you're more at an advantage with regards to the stuff that you get to learn and how you understand the aviation industry from the perspective of an instructor or a qualified person versus, that's getting into the industry is not so difficult. The challenge is getting into the airline, which is what a lot of people actually want to do. So to become a pilot it's not as strenuous as you'd expect. Like for instance, like I mentioned, to get the private pilot's license, you study 8 exams and you write and pass those exams. A pass mark is 75%, and then you get different milestones. The first milestone is your first solo, where you take off and you land on your own without an instructor in the cockpit.
That must be like, my goodness. I mean, wow.
No, it is.
It's the most solo.
Yeah, it's the most exhilarating, and in every situation, it's the most, I don't think there's anything more exciting than that first solo, because that's that first instance where you are fully in control of the aircraft without any assistance. It's nerve-wracking, it's scary, but also very exciting, because that's the point when you realize that actually I can do this. I can do this.
And also you've been planning for it your whole life. I mean, that's
precisely, that's always been the goal. And now when you finally realize that it's actually possible, it's the best feeling. And I think the most challenging is getting the plane on the ground. So you take off, it's quite okay, but getting the plane on the ground is the most challenging. So you go through the first milestone, which is the first solo, and then you get the gaps in between, and eventually you get private pilot's license. And if you want to move on to the commercial side of things, you've got another 10 exams that you need to study and pass for. Again, pass mark is 75%. And with the law now being as it is, very strict and stringent as to how many times you can write and fail or write and pass the exam, which I'm grateful for, because we don't want to find ourselves in an environment where the pilots don't actually know their work.
We still want, flights to be the safest place.
Yes, precisely. And then from there, once you have received your commercial pilot's license, then there's the next phase, which is the accumulating the hours, which is the next biggest challenge.
Okay. So just explain to us, is there a degree that you study, or is it just these exams? How does that work?
It's just the exams. There isn't a direct degree, and this is why it was important for me to become an engineer, because once the license is no longer valid, and the license stops being valid if you are not able to fly as a result of your medical exam being cancelled. So there's no degree. It's the exams that you study and pass, as well as the hours that you accumulate. Like driving, I always relate it to driving. When you start getting your license, the first time you get your license, you're very anxious, you're cautious, you're uncomfortable. So the more you practice or the more you fly, the better you become at it. And that's why it's important for airlines to employ people with more than 1,500 hours. They never employ people with less than that, because naturally your ability and your muscle memory is very weak at the earlier flights, or rather at the fewer hours, rather than at a later stage.
And how did you go getting your 1,500 hours?
I'm not actually at 1,500 hours. I currently have 1,100 hours at this point.
Okay,
so
you're nearly there on the
I'm
break.
almost, I'm getting there. So like I mentioned earlier, you get your private pilot's license, your commercial pilot's license, and then afterwards you get your airline transport pilot's license, and that's where you're actually able to apply and get into an airline. So I've accumulated my hours through Instruction. So I got my commercial pilot's license, which is the blue book, in 2016. That's when I officially became a commercial pilot. So at that point, technically, I was employable. However, like I'm saying, safety is very important. So 90% of airlines, if not all of them, would prefer pilots to actually have more hours, more flying hours. It goes together with the fact that your muscle memory, like I just mentioned, is a lot better. You're more aware, you're more alert, and you're also more confident. I remember when I started my flight training, I was a nervous wreck. I knew I wanted to do it, but because it was something I'd never experienced, I was constantly like,
I can imagine.
what? Why am I doing this? How on earth? So I did my commercial pilot's license, and I did an instructor's rating, which is a 6-month program where you basically are taught how to give instruction, and you're taught how to teach somebody else to become a pilot. And that's how I've accumulated my 1,100 hours.
And how did you enjoy that, teaching somebody else what you've
Nerve-wracking. To be quite fair, I never ever considered myself as an instructor. I never considered myself as somebody who
that
could
wasn't
teach.
your ambition.
It was never the ambition. It was never the goal. When I finally got my foot into the aviation industry, a lot of doors opened, and I was so shocked as to what is actually going on within the industry. I had no idea. I mean, for instance, when I started my flight training, there was a point where the flight school I started training at told me I was not competent to be a pilot. And they told me I should actually just go back into engineering. I was never going to make it.
Wow.
So
people dare to say such things.
I know, right?
Amazing.
So I was actually told I'd never become a pilot. So I shifted flight schools, and I went to a flight school in Johannesburg, in Rand Airport. And that's where I completed my training. So as that was happening, I realized that there's actually a lot more within the aviation industry besides what is commonly known as you get your license and you go into the airline. And that's when I discovered that actually there is another avenue. There's a lot of avenues actually. So you could get your commercial pilot's license and be a bush pilot, or you could be fly for charter companies, which usually fly smaller aircrafts instead of your Airbus and your Boeing, which is the airline types of aircraft. Or you could go into Instruction, which is the route that I took. So unfortunately or fortunately, at the time when I got into the industry, a lot of doors were closing in terms of bush flying. So bush flying is basically flying in places like Botswana, where you're flying to remote areas where there aren't actual airports.
Okay.
So before I got into the industry, or before I started flying, it was easy for one to get their commercial pilot's license from South Africa, move over to Botswana or Namibia and start flying in the bush. Even in that case, you're still flying a smaller aircraft, but you're accumulating the hours and you're gaining the experience. So I found it very difficult to actually move into that section, which is what I thought I'd probably do after I got my commercial pilot's license. Then I discovered, you know what, instruction might not be a bad thing, because I had a stint in tutoring. I spent a year after I matriculated doing tutoring part-time. So I was a maths tutor part-time after matric. And so I figured, you know what, maybe it's not going to be such a bad idea. I possibly could actually pull this off. But for me, it was still an issue in terms of my confidence, because I had been kicked out of flight school. I'd been kicked out of the first flight school. So it was quite strenuous, because I was thinking, if these guys consider me not competent to actually become a pilot, what makes me think I'll be able to teach? Exactly. Like my entire dream, my whole life.
Wow.
So I was very anxious about it. So I figured, you know what, right now it's the only option I have. I'm going to do it and enjoy it as part of the journey, and not sit down and complain and sulk and say, okay, no, it's not working out the way I wanted. Let's rather enjoy it as part of the journey. And at this point, I can definitely say, looking back, it was the best decision I've ever made, because I'm finding that I'm actually very competent and very good actually at what I do. And this brings me to what my current position is now, which is a flight commander. So I work at a company in the Western Cape, and basically it's an instruction, it's a flight school.
Okay.
So the flight school, basically what it does is or any flight school for that matter, you get a group of students and you get instructors to teach the students how to fly. So within a company as big as the one I work for currently, you have groups or hierarchy, like in any company. So you get your junior leveled instructors, and then you get your sort of mid-level, not like most senior, and then you get your senior instructors. So in a company as big as the one I work for currently, you have your junior instructors, and then you have your senior instructors, and you have the guys that come in between the head boss, which is the chief flight instructor, as well as the not so senior instructors. So I fall literally in between the chief flight instructor as well as the not so senior instructors, which is where my title comes in, is as a flight commander. So flight commander actually works very well in flight schools that are really large. So the current flight school I'm in, as well as another one in the Eastern Cape called 43, are the biggest flight schools within South Africa. So that's where you get a title called flight commander. So basically what it is I do currently is to mentor the junior instructors and basically help them to make sure that the students come out at the end of their training competent and as best as they possibly can be. So within South Africa there's over 1,000 flight schools. So I specifically chose the Chinese link because of the fact that I know that the process, or rather the number of students that come into the flight school, are quite ample. The challenge with the instruction phase of things is that you have to sort of market yourself and sort of get yourself out there in order to be able to get the students to instruct and be able to continue with your progress. So without the students, you basically become unemployed. So if there's no student that you're instructing, you're sitting on the ground and you're not accumulating the hours. So the reason I chose that company in particular was because of the fact that it's a large company and there's structure. That was the most important thing for me. The fact that there is structure and there is hierarchy. A lot of the flight schools within Johannesburg, there is structure and there is hierarchy. However, the students are not constantly there. So I mean, a student can come in now and then not fly for another 6 months because of finances or because of issues or health issues, whatever the case might be. Whereas in an structured environment, you are able to actually work consistently and consecutively as the instructor, and anywhere else it becomes quite a challenge to actually proceed and go through that whole process. So currently for me, the aim is to get to the 1,500 hours. When I hit that 1,000-hour milestone, which is a very big milestone, when I hit that 1,000-hour milestone, I was in tears because it's been such a journey. It's been challenging. It's been
expensive.
Extremely expensive.
So what did
extremely
you do?
expensive.
I mean, I know being a flight instructor, obviously you get paid.
Yeah, I get a salary.
But how do you manage that, and how would you suggest that people manage the expense of this?
So obviously in the initial phases, it's self-funded before you become an instructor, because as an instructor you are technically employed. You are employed actually, which means you are getting a salary. So you're paying very little towards sustaining the license versus beforehand. There's companies like the South African Civil Aviation Authority and Transport, or rather TITA, which is a government SETA that's specifically directed at getting people into transport and logistics.
Okay.
So those are the two main companies currently in South Africa that offer funding and sponsorship towards aviation and flying. There used to be South African Airways as well, which is how I started my flight training. As economy has it currently, SAA is not in the best standing, so that's no longer an option. So there are avenues, but it is extremely challenging to get that funding. Prior to getting your license, it's the challenges of finances, it's challenges of the flight school, it's the challenges. I mean, some flight schools in Johannesburg aren't even able to sustain because aviation as an industry is not very easy to sustain. So even as SAA is in its current position, it's not actually shocking because you need to try and make profit versus the loss. Without the profit, the company cannot continue. So companies in Johannesburg, for instance, you find they're getting a bunch of students, but the students aren't having enough money to continue with their training. So when the time comes where, or rather at the point where the student does not afford to continue with their training, that means the flight school is not able to get money, which then means the instructor is not getting a salary. So it's a domino effect. Yeah, it's a domino effect. And like those are the challenges a lot of us face within the aviation industry. And then there's still challenges after. I know a lot of my friends and my counterparts who've gotten the commercial pilot's license, but because they were doing other things before they got into the industry, they realized they won't be able to sustain financially once they become instructors, because instruction is not lucrative. No, it's definitely not lucrative. I find instruction, personally, I think as an instructor, you'd be better off at an older age, once you've been through the airline, once you've sort of accumulated some amount of income and you're using it as a place where you're sort of retiring, or you're at an early stage where you're trying to get yourself going. It is not lucrative at all. Sometimes you don't get paid. And the reason you don't get paid, and this is mostly with the flight schools that are not like structured like where I work, is again because you find the student for a couple of months, 6 months, they have the funding, and then after that they can't continue. And it has to do with weather. So if for the 6 months they have the funding, they're traveling to the flight school or whatever the case might be, and they're able to fly. And then 6 months after that, there's no funding, or the weather's bad, or whatever the case might be, it causes a huge delay. And then somehow this person has to manage to find funding. Like, just to give you an estimate of the costs for the training, for a private pilot's license, which is not even going to get you into an airline, on average, you're looking at spending 100,000 Rand over a period of 6 months, because it's a short course with all the exams and the flight training, and the most expensive part is the aircraft, because you have to
afford that.
No. Like, where do you have 100,000 just lying around over a period of 6 months? So, and then for your commercial pilot's license, you're looking at 500,000, probably $1 million, depending on where you're training and how often you're flying. And the thing with the flight, or rather with the training, you want to be consistent. So you want to try and fly as often as you possibly can. Muscle memory disappears, you get rusty, and as soon as you get rusty, then you have to spend more money to try and catch up what you already knew.
Tell us about your experiences as a black woman, the desire to be a pilot, and seeing that through. I can't imagine that was very easy.
No, definitely not. Challenges within the flight schools is that you discover, and it's very subtle, it's very undercurrent. You discover that there's a lot of animosity because BEE. A lot of people think that because BEE exists, that their jobs are now threatened. So you find a black girl and don't know anything about aviation. I'm brand new to the industry, and I'm moving into a space where predominantly white people run the industry, and I have literally no idea what's actually happening. And the general consensus, or the general process, is to assume that because you're interested in something, that you'd make an effort to actually find out more. For instance, with me, I knew I wanted to be a pilot, and I attended air shows. However, I didn't know where to access the information. I didn't know where to find it.
It does seem very difficult.
It is
to figure out.
Yeah. I mean, it's you want to do the thing, but where do you start? Where do you wake up and say, okay, this is where I'm going to look for the information?
It's not like you want to study accounting, so you go to
precisely an accounting firm or a university.
Yeah,
and there aren't really any road shows to explain the whole process. So even though I went to a lot of air shows, I still wasn't able to get into direct contact with somebody who was a pilot. I'd go there and I'd see them flying around, but there weren't many stalls or stands where people are actually explaining the process. And when they did, it was very shallow. They didn't go in depth with the whole process. So when I did eventually get into flight training, I realized I had no idea what I was getting myself into, mostly with regards to the animosity and the treatment that you get from instructors particularly, which is unfortunate. And that's the one thing I've constantly been saying to myself. I'd like to bridge that gap where I make people understand that it's the students that are important. Where when I was doing my flight training, I had an instant and it was very heartbreaking, and I always tried to think, you know what, it made me who I am now. I started my flight training. I struggled. I had challenges. I had a low self-esteem at the time because I didn't understand what was going on, and you don't really get the full details about what's happening.
Like, pilots, like you
Precisely what is actually happening. Precisely. Whereas a lot of white people have that. They have somebody who's somebody within the family where they pick up the phone and they say, what exactly? So I did my training. I had a bit of challenges here and there, but it wasn't anything extraordinary. So the first solo, on average, people go solo at about 15 hours of flight training. I went solo at about 24 hours, which according to a lot of people is shocking. But if you think about our history as Black people, we're not exposed to anything. We're not exposed to those kinds of environments. So technically me going solo at 24 hours is actually okay for the kind of background that I had. And from that point, I don't even want to say I was targeted, because I think it was a thing that happened prior to me actually getting there. But that's actually what happened. You get there and you start your training, and because you're not sure of what actually is happening, when you do try to ask, people don't give you the full answers, and they sort of create a barrier for you to actually eventually I did go solo, and I noticed my confidence start to pick up. And then I wrote the exams. Like I mentioned, there's 8 exams, or 10 rather, that you need to pass. So with the program that I was doing, it's an integrated program. So we didn't get a private pilot's license from the get-go. You just go straight to the commercial pilot. So I wrote the 4 exams and I got 90s for every one of them. I passed on the first attempt. There was no challenges with regards to my exams.
And that's what you probably needed as well.
Exactly, as a confidence booster. However, just when I was about to test the private pilot's license phase of things within the integrated course, the weather went bad. There was just a lot of things that just weren't working in my favor. So I think at that point my confidence got a kick as well, because now I went through a phase where I didn't fly for about 2-3 weeks, just non-stop.
Frustrating.
And then when I did eventually fly, my confidence was down again. So I went through a phase where I constantly had to repeat my test, the test that allows you to get your PPL. And I did it the first time and my instructor said, no, you're horrible. And then I did it the second time and I eventually got into remedial. And then they just eventually decided, you know what, you're not going to be able to continue flying. And that's when the company that was sponsoring me at the time, they called me up and they said to me, listen, we know that chances are you are going to make it as a pilot in the long run. However, at this point, we can't continue paying. And for me, I felt that it was unfair because there was never any communication between myself and the sponsors. It was just open, airy-fairy. I had no one to talk to. I had no support system. The only support system was my family, and they don't even know anything about aviation. So it was a bit of a challenge with regards to that. And then
so that's a big responsibility that you have now as a Black woman who's experienced this.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Is this why you chose to then write your blog and to put the word out
yes
there?
Yeah, no, that is the exact reason. And initially, before I started the blog, I had so much to talk about. I still do, actually. But when I discovered how many girls, especially girls, are coming up to me and saying, what do I need to do? What is the exact process? Where do I go? And once they're in there, what is the procedure? That's when I realized actually it's not a bad idea to actually get the word out there so that people have access to this kind of information where I didn't have the access. I mean, having somebody you can pick up the phone or send a message to say I don't know what's going on, I don't understand.
How
where
did
can I
you
find
do this? Yes.
Where can I find this information? Is there anywhere? I mean, when I started my training, I wasn't even aware at the amount of law that actually exists within the aviation industry. I mean, had I known what I know now back then, I would have been in a completely different situation, because I would have been able to state that actually I'm not in a bad space. I just need you to teach me. And I think that's where the challenge is within the industry. You find a lot of instructors are doing it simply to get the hours, and they're no longer applying their passion. They're passionate about aviation and maybe not necessarily about instructing, and then they enforcing their lack of luster or shine into the student. And then as the process continues, the student doesn't come out as best as they possibly can because there wasn't the correct grooming and training. And this is why I say to you now that I'm grateful that I actually got into instruction, because I'm realizing now that actually I have a big role to play within my industry. And it might not be in direct contact with the people that I'd like to directly affect. But the fact that I'm there is a good way for them to realize that actually it is quite possible. We can actually do it. And there is space for us within the industry. And like Zozibini said, that it's important for us to take up space. It's very, very important to put our feet on the ground and actually state that we deserve to be here.
And we're going to do it.
And we're going to do it.
Tell us about the typical life of a pilot, your day to day.
So as an instructor, being an instructor, I always say to people that being an instructor doesn't stop me from saying I'm a pilot. I am a pilot. However, based on the portion of the industry that I'm in, is sort of different to what an airline pilot would actually be doing. So as an instructor, an average day, wake up at 3 a.m, do a morning briefing at 4 a.m. Morning briefing basically entails explaining to the students what's going to be happening for that particular day, emergencies that they could potentially encounter, and basically safety. Basically a safety briefing as to what we could expect for the day. Between 4 and 5, we do a pre-flight inspection. Pre-flight inspection, you basically do a walkabout of the aircraft to confirm that it's safe to take off. And at that
you're
point,
responsible as the
yes,
pilot,
I am responsible. Yeah, the pilot in command, which is what we call it, is responsible for that flight. So, for instance, if it's a solo flight with regards to instruction or this area of the industry that I'm in, the person or the student who's flying on their own on that particular day is responsible for that. So for me, day to day, from the instructor's perspective, we do the morning briefing, and then we do a pre-flight inspection. Then we brief the student, the individual student, as to what's going to be happening for the day, or whatever the sortie is going to be. So we call it a sortie. So basically the exercise that's going to be happening for that morning. We give the student a brief explanation. At that point, you're hoping that the student is actually prepared. Sometimes they don't prepare, which is very frustrating. You're hoping that the student has prepared for the morning's lesson. You give a 20 to 30 minute briefing as to what the student is expected to do within the hour of flight, as well as basically what I'm going to do in the cockpit. And then from there, you sign out. So it's a lot of paperwork within the aviation industry. You get into the aircraft, you fly. Maximum flying I can do as an instructor is 6 hours in a day, which is extremely taxing. I mean, before I started instruction, I used to think, 6 hours is a walk in the park. But when you think about it, you're sitting there in a cockpit with this person who knows very little about aviation, and I'm expected to impart all the knowledge.
As you fly,
yeah.
checking that they are being
yes, exactly, precisely, that he or she is safe, that they understand what the information that you're imparting, that you are able to demonstrate, because within the cockpit, I have to demonstrate prior to them actually executing the exercise. And while they're executing the exercise, there's communications constantly happening. So you have air traffic controllers communicating with you. You are trying to convey a message to the student, and you're constantly looking around to confirm that the aircraft is still doing what it's supposed to do. So day to day is quite hectic. On average, my day ends around 1 in the afternoon, but that's just the flying side of things. From 1 to about 3, I have to deal with paperwork. I have to deal with debriefing, explaining to the student, are you sure you understood what we discussed? Do you understand what is expected of you for the next flight? And things of that sort. So on average, a pilot, I'm not necessarily as an instructor or a charter pilot or an airline pilot, you're looking at about a 15 to 16 hour day, which I remember in my interview, they asked me before I got into aviation, are you prepared for the long hour days? And I thought,
these people are kidding.
They're joking. What's a long hour day? But which is why it's important to be passionate. It's so important to have the passion.
Right?
Yeah, with everything, it's important for you to have a serious drive and a love for it, because if you don't, by the 5th hour in the day, you will be exhausted and you'll just want to let go and quit.
Yeah, but I mean, can you imagine students the whole day like that? That's
It's rough. No, it's a lot.
But I mean,
it's a lot for
I would
the students.
think that, I mean, much like a doctor, I mean, for me, I always want to find out from a doctor, did you work at Bara? Because for me, Bara is the standard. Didn't work at Bara. I'm not sure I really want to come and see you.
Exactly,
You know?
yeah.
So I mean, I think being a flight instructor is a very good. It's a very good idea.
No, it definitely is.
Yeah.
It definitely is. I think it's a good pathway for anybody who wants to become an airline pilot as well. It opens you up to a lot of stuff. It opens you up to what exists in the industry. It opens you up to the fact that you can fly different planes. That's the other thing. I mean, if you go straight into the airline, you're structured or strictly stuck in one aircraft or type of aircraft for about 4 or 5 years before you can actually move on to the next thing. So as an instructor, you actually have the ability to move around from here to here and gain a lot of experience, and you're exposed to different types of characters as well. And in the airline, and this is based on what my airline friends have actually told me, in the airline and as well as theory from flight training, you find you are working with a captain who's got an authoritative personality, and he's just like no go, and you've never experienced that type of character outside of the cockpit, and now suddenly you have to sort of balance yourself as a person to try and say, okay, there's something going wrong. How do you portray that message to this person who says it's my way or the highway? So with instruction, I've learned a lot to deal with different characters. I've learned a lot to deal with different types of people. You find a certain student who's shy, doesn't want to open up, doesn't want to communicate, or is completely afraid. And I've had to learn to sort of get to a point where, you know, you pull this person out of them. And I've found cocky students as well. Extremely arrogant students who just think they know everything. And I've found that instruction has actually helped me quite a bit, as well as with regards to coming out of my shell, as well as to be able to be bold and take up space. It's taught me to actually be able to say, I can do what I'm doing. And just because I'm not where everybody else thinks I should be within an airline, it does not mean I cannot portray or impart it precisely.
It's not part of.
It's not an impossibility. Yeah. It's not something that's never going to happen. It's just part of the journey, and it's literally instruction has taught me how to stand my ground, and I'm super grateful for that. I'm glad.
I suppose you also learn quite a bit about what could go wrong.
Yes, I mean, yes, you know, definitely, and there's a lot. There's a whole lot that could go wrong.
So tell us about one of those days. Something's gone wrong.
I'm not trying to scare anybody, but for instance, I had an incident earlier on this year. We took off with my student. It was a training flight, and the training flight was to fly from Beaufort West, which is where I'm based, to Port Elizabeth. Nothing unusual about that. We do it often. From time to time, we fly from Beaufort West to Bloemfontein or Cape Town or George, wherever the point might be, because a lot of the initial phases of your flight training is within a very confined space. So that morning, I did the morning briefing and I checked the weather. You confirmed that the weather's suitable. Will we be able to take off? Yes, we can take off. The weather here is okay. Can we fly to our destination? Yes, we can fly to our destination. And bear in mind, we're flying very small aircrafts. I don't know if you've seen the light aircrafts. They're quite small. They are not best in terms of handling strong winds or whatever the case might be. And you've only got a limited amount of fuel. It's not like in a jet where you've got possibly 10 hours of fuel within the aircraft. Light aircraft, the maximum hours of fuel that you can get is a 6-hour flight. So basically, you plan accordingly, you confirm that, do I have sufficient fuel to get me from point A to B? And unlike a car, you've got winds that impact your flight. So if you plan for a calm morning or a calm day where it's not windy, then you hope and pray that it stays like that. On this particular day, the planning was for a calm day. There was we didn't anticipate any bad weather, cloudy conditions, or strong winds. But on our way back, and flying towards Port Elizabeth, everything was smooth. But on our way back, we discovered that the winds had suddenly picked up. They were a lot stronger than what was anticipated. So we had sufficient fuel to get us from Beaufort West to Port Elizabeth and back based on the winds that were forecast in the morning. Now remember...
And PE being PE.
Exactly, strong winds. So bear in mind, a forecast is exactly that. It's not a prediction. It's not something that stays constant. So even as a average Joe, when you watch the weather, they say to you tomorrow's going to be sunny, and then suddenly you wake up and it's cloudy.
I don't think we trust the weather.
Exactly. Precisely. So on that particular day, we planned as best as we possibly could, and on our way back, we discovered that the winds were a lot stronger. So in my thought process and in my experience at the time, I think I had about 700 hours or so of flying at that point in time. I said to myself, there's something odd about the situation. Let me try and confirm with the guys at our base, Beaufort West, what is actually happening on the ground. And I was grateful that I did at that point in time, because I realized the winds were getting stronger and stronger. And it was earlier in our flight on our way back rather than later. Because if it had been later, we would have run out of fuel halfway through the flight, and that would have ended in a complete disaster. So, but as an instructor, it's important to always have your cell phone in the event of an emergency or an instance like this. So I pull out my phone to check what the weather updates were at the base airport, and I discovered that things were actually getting a bit hectic. So I changed frequency on the radio and our communication systems, and I tried to contact the guys at our base airport, and they did state that the winds were getting completely out of control, and that there were a couple of students who were unable to land, and it was 2 solo students. So there was 2 aircraft, separate aircrafts with a student in each aircraft. So there wasn't an instructor in the aircraft, which is very scary because now one student had come back from a cross-country flight like we were, and the other one was just in the general flying area. So I had to sort of sort them out and get them back to another airport, basically a diversion, to make sure that they land safely without experiencing a fatal accident or a plane crash as a result of low fuel. So at that point, when I contacted them via frequency, they did say that the weather was bad. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to turn back because there is an airport closer to our current position at the time. And I figured, let's just turn back. And I quickly asked the student to do some replanning, find out if we are going to have enough fuel to get.
Was the student not panicking?
He was. They do panic. They panic quite often. So I said to the student, listen, I'll take control and I'll continue flying the plane, and I'll listen to our radios to confirm what the other students are doing, because now they also have to fly to the other airport. And he did his calculations, and then I checked and rechecked. I think I checked about 5 times just to make sure that his calculations were good. Now, my situation was handled because we've already made the correct decision to fly to another airport. It's clearly being able to identify that we can't make it to our base airport. Now, the next challenge was to make sure that the solo students make it safely on the ground. Communicating is another challenge because these are Chinese students. So I had to try and communicate to them how to fly from our base airport to the other airport, which is relatively close, but they'd never done it before. So I was constantly trying to say to them, okay, fly this heading so that you can actually just fly south. Do not turn left, do not turn right, just fly south and maintain a specific altitude. Fortunately, it went well. There weren't any incidences. We did land on just below reserve fuel. So the law states that below 45 minutes is an emergency. We did land with just below 45 minutes, and I'm grateful that we did actually manage to land, but it does require for one to think on their toes immediately. And if you are in doubt, there is no doubt. If at any given point in the aircraft you're feeling doubtful, then that means you must act immediately. Never wait or delay and think, okay, no, it's going to get better, because usually it doesn't get better. And there's a model that we call the Swiss cheese model. So basically what happens is that you have layers of Swiss cheese lining up to create a whole. And usually when things line up in that scenario, that incident, eventually there's going to be an accident, whether it's an accident or an incident. So there's always things that sort of pile up.
Is
Very important. So never at any given point, as a student, as an airline pilot, as anything within the aviation industry, never take anything for granted, because at any given point things could go wrong. And unfortunately, even though aviation has so few accidents, when there is an accident, it's catastrophic.
Major.
It's catastrophic.
Yes.
Death actually happens. I actually lost a friend of mine very recently to a plane crash, and I still can't understand what actually happened or what went wrong. And it's scary because he was an instructor as well, and you never think or dream that somebody you know that close would actually experience such a thing. And as instructors, as pilots, we never want to get complacent to the point where you're saying it could never happen to me. But it does. It does happen, and you're taken aback and you're shocked, because you're like, wow, how on earth? And like I'm saying now, you're constantly checking, trying to make sure. However, unfortunately, as the aviation industry would have it, there's only so much you could prepare for. There's only so much you can't always be 250% prepared. But in the event that you do find yourself in an uncomfortable situation, the best, like I'm saying, if there's a doubt, then there's definitely no doubt. Yeah.
Terry, who's been your most interesting passenger thus far?
So by virtue of being an instructor and not actually having passengers in the cockpit, my most interesting student thus far has been, there's actually been a lot. But the most interesting was one student, as a flight commander, or rather as a senior instructor, let me put it that way, as a senior instructor, we have the privileges of doing a test flight with students to make sure that they're competent to go solo. And there was a student, wow.
I hope you didn't tell them that they're not competent.
No, well, I just told him that he's not competent at that present moment. So he was just, that was a disaster, just to put it lightly. Until this day, I've not experienced anything worse than that child. I don't even understand what the issue is, because he can actually fly a plane. Just his thought process is a bit
warped.
Yeah. And the reason he was the most interesting, it's not the fact that he was struggling, because we all struggle.
Yeah.
The most interesting part was that he didn't think he was struggling.
Oh my
He,
goodness.
so
that is
different level altogether.
Yeah.
So we take off and we brief each other, the whole process. We have a conversation, and I say to him, this is what I expect of you for this flight. This is your solo test, your solo check flight. So you know what's expected. Let's go do it. So in a test flight scenario, the instructor has to spend less time communicating. So at this point, the student is at the correct stage. Yes, precisely. Yeah. It's exactly like a driver's test. So at that point, I shouldn't be making as many inputs as I would in a training environment. So we get into the aircraft, he starts taxiing. So taxiing is basically the aircraft moving on the ground without actually being airborne. He starts taxiing, things are going well. Radio calls are quite good as well. He's communicating very well with the ATC. And then at some point, we're airborne, and this human being just is not picking up the visual cues, which is very important. Visual cues are your airspeed, your power settings, and the things that you need to focus on to ensure that we can land back safely on the ground. So I say to him, do you notice your airspeed? We're a little bit slow. And he says, yes, ma'am. And I say to him, okay. He fixes it. And then we continue flying. The third attempt at a landing, we were not even on the runway. We were far to the right of the runway.
So you're like risking your life here.
Every second, literally every second. So I'm sitting there and I ask him very calmly, because I don't see the point of screaming and shouting within a cockpit, particularly in that type of situation. The student might panic and it might end up disastrous. So I ask him, where is the runway? And he points at it to our left-hand side. So I say to him, so what are you doing? And he says, I'm landing. So I say, where are you landing? And he says, on the runway. So I said, but the runway is on the left. And he says, yes, ma'am. And he continues flying. So my thought process at that time is, what are you going to do about it? Because if I'm going to send you solo, I need to know that you're able to handle a situation. And he just sits there and he says, I'm landing. And the next thing, we're banking towards the aircraft. We're literally turning, sharp turn towards the aircraft, correction the runway, and we're close to the ground. That is completely dangerous behavior. So I say to him, I have control. I'm going to handle it this time. So I add full power, and this is a process called a go around. I add full power and I don't bother landing, because it's an unsafe situation. If he had attempted to land there and then, we would not have made it and we would have died. And I take control. We attempt the fourth landing. And he says to me, ma'am, did I pass my check? My facial expression.
And your eyes, I'm sure.
My eyes were completely out the window. So I say to him, no, you have not. And I'm not going to continue this flight, because you have no idea what's actually happening. When I land and ATC says to me, what just happened? And I say to them, I don't know. I said, literally, they said to me they were waiting to push the emergency button because it was not looking good. And this was after 3 attempts at a landing. So first attempt, usually you think, okay, the student is nervous, maybe they're not quite there. But once the student is unable to identify the dangerous or the hazards, then it becomes a problem. And then to top it off, he asks, did I pass my solo check? But how?
But it's hope, guys. It's hope. We must have hope. Oh my gosh,
so
has he managed?
He eventually managed. No, he eventually managed. He's actually a very bright student. I think that's the other. It's the problem. Yeah, I think that's the challenge. He tested. Yeah, he tested his commercial pilot's license, and he's moving on. He's practically about to go back to China. Well done to him. he's actually super intelligent. And I think within the aviation industry, that is a challenge. You find people who are super bright, so they get exams and they pass the exams 100%, and then they struggle with the aircraft.
And your dream passenger?
Before I actually got into instruction full time, I had an experience where I was doing a bit of scenic flying in Joburg. So we'd take off. It was the best experience.
Yeah.
So we'd take off at Rand Airport and we'd fly around from Germiston, overhead Sandton CBD, Kailami racetrack. Then we'd go to Soccer City. And then back. So my dream passenger was this guy who was extremely afraid of heights. He was just like, why would anyone bring me here? So it was a surprise from the friend. And the friend was like, I know you're gonna hate me for this, but I want you to try it anyway. And when he landed, he said to me, I'm so grateful I experienced it. I respect pilots a lot more than I'd ever respected them before. Because he said to me, I feel like, you know what, it's an easy job, there's nothing to it. But he said to me, I am very afraid of heights, but now that I've experienced this, I'm aware what goes into flying and why you guys are able to keep us safe. And that for me was beautiful, because you don't really get to be thanked. You don't really get to experience where somebody says to you, thank you for keeping me safe. Thank you for preventing me from actually dying.
Sometimes we drink some wine and
to
we
make
clap
sure.
when we clap when we land. It doesn't happen often.
No, it's not often. It's not often at all. So during that scenic flying, that was my best passenger. I've actually got a video of it, and I go back to it every now and again when I'm feeling like, oh my word, things are draining currently, or I'm feeling like my goals or the plans that I've made are sort of taking a back fall and they're not getting to where they are as quickly as I'd like to. I look at that and I'm like, actually, I'm doing this and I love it. That was the best passenger by far. So the blog started as a result of me feeling as though I need to get information across. When it started, I was really skeptical about doing it, because a lot of the times I think the amount of information I have to give is not valuable, or somebody might not need it, which is a strange thing. But when it started, it was just, who's going to read my blog? Why would anyone be interested in? And strangely enough, a lot of people actually do read it. A lot of people do find it interesting, and basically talks about the aviation industry and the journey and the process and the things that you do encounter within the aviation industry. It's called Consistent Inconsistency. The reason for that is because you're inconsistent. It becomes such an inconsistent thing because you try to be consistent, however, the weather slows you down, or your finances slow you down, or you discover there's something that you don't know that you actually should have known. And that's where the title came about, because I was saying you're there and you're progressing, but I mean, if you don't have the passion or the stronghold or the thing to keep you going, you feel like you're falling behind. But it's a constant, just stay at it. Just stay at it. It basically talks about my journey within the aviation industry and how I got to where I am now.
So one of your personal mantras is that money recognizes me, money is comfortable around me, and money
likes me.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned earlier, instruction is not lucrative. Yes. So as an instructor, you do want to find other ways and means to actually make the money. However, I found that if you are doing what you love, the money becomes something that you don't even get concerned with. And so this year, for instance, I've had an increase in salary, I think, twice or three times in a short space of time. In a very short space of time, I've had where, I was upgrading. I was climbing that ladder. I was climbing that ladder quite quickly, which is something that was not planned. Obviously, you make the plans and you set goals for yourself, but it came automatically. It was flowing towards me, and I think that mantra. Yes, exactly. That was just my time, and I think for me, the mantra became a thing that I was using because I didn't want to sit and worry about finances. I didn't want to sit because, as any human being has it, you have to have finances.
It's a capitalist world.
Precisely. You have to have the finances. You need to be able to at least sustain yourself as a person, not just within the work that you're doing, but just outside. I mean, we're not saying that because I'm a pilot, the only thing I do is to fly. I've got other interests like hiking and backpacking, etc., etc. So I chose to actually use that mantra because I didn't want to sit and stress about the money. And it's been working quite well. And I like that because then I can continue focusing on my passion, which is flying. I really enjoy flying. I love it. I can't even explain how much I enjoy that feeling. When I put on my uniform this morning, I am on leave, but when I put it on this morning, I was like, I want to go fly.
But is it the power?
No, not even. It's the feeling. An amazing feeling. I like the feeling of knowing that I can take off and land, and the physics behind it as well still fascinates me. I fly. I've got 1,000 hours of flight time, but I'm still like, whoa, this is me. Yeah.
On your blog, you mentioned that a purpose is only a purpose if it helps people.
Definitely. So from early stages, like I mentioned, I didn't fall into instructional automatically. It's not something that I wanted to do. However, as an instructor the past couple of years, I've realized that actually it's important to be somebody who's actually giving back to the community. So my vocation is to fly, which is something I love. It's something that I do. However, along the lines, I started feeling as though I wasn't giving back in a way that I would have liked to. I wasn't doing anything for other people. So that's when I sort of discovered that actually the reason why I've always wanted to be a pilot was because it is a purpose. However, that's not just the only thing. The importance of it is for me to give back and to make sure that whoever comes behind me is able to progress and not go through the same challenges that I've been through. So for me, the importance of being a pilot, not just being an instructor, is to make sure that even though it is my purpose, let me use it to actually help somebody else, because if I'm not helping, then I'm just doing it for myself, and it gets really boring when it happens like that. It gets boring and gets mundane. Yes, and it gets very unfulfilling. So I've learned that actually, in as much as it is my purpose and this is exactly where I need to be in order for it to become fulfilling, or to be as fulfilling as it possibly can, I need to help other people. And in the process, I've found so many people that have helped me as well, who are also pilots. I've found so much assistance within the industry after actually getting to into the industry and learning and finding my footing. I've got so many pilot friends who are always just checking in and finding out, are you okay? And that's how I'm realizing that that's how they are serving their purpose as well. And sometimes we assume that your purpose, or rather how you help, is through a large mass, and that's not always the case. Sometimes it's 3 or 4 people that you reach out to and you discover actually I've made a difference in their lives. And at this point, I think there are some lives that I have touched. I mean, and from time to time I get DMs on my Instagram from people in Morocco. I've had a girl from Morocco speak to me and find out, what can I do? How do I become a pilot? I read your blog and you've actually motivated me. So that's where the purpose, only being a purpose if you're helping. If you're not helping and you're not assisting anyone, I think you're purposeless, basically.
I have to agree with that. So you have reached your 1,100 hours. You're aiming to reach 1,500.
Yeah.
What's next for Terry?
So the next thing is to get a rating. So a rating is basically transitioning from one type of aircraft onto the next aircraft. So the largest aircraft I've flown currently is a pistoned type aircraft, which basically means that it runs on an engine that a car runs off of. Okay. But it's got 2 of those. So the biggest that I've flown is a 6-seater twinned engine aircraft. So the next step is to try and get into a charter company by doing a rating for an aircraft called the 1900. So next step is to bridge the gap between being an instructor and an airline pilot. And I've gone in for a lot of interviews and they all say the same thing. They say, you know, as an instructor, you don't really have operational experience. So what they mean by operational experience is that you know how to fly the plane. You're very good at flying the plane. Okay. However, you're not really exposed to the requirements that they have within the airline. And that basically means that the operations within the airline are slightly different. It's the same process, same type of procedures. However, the knowledge is different from the knowledge that you have as an instructor. So what's next for me? I'm looking to get that rating on a turbine engined aircraft, and then from there try and get a job away from the instruction side of things. I'd love to still freelance as an instructor in Joburg. However, the goal is eventually to get into an airline, but most importantly is to enjoy the process. That's very important for you. Definitely looking at getting into a charter company, flying in Africa. I've always wanted to fly in Africa. I've always dreamed of flying within Africa. Well, I mean, South Africa is within Africa, but I mean, outside of the South African borders, I mean, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, Tanzania even. That's what I'm looking at. And next 5 years, hopefully, get into an airline eventually. My dream airline, still Ethiopian Airlines. Still Ethiopian Airlines. If you're watching, I'm still here. So that's basically the plans for the next couple of years for me.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Terry. I've learned a great deal. I'm sure a lot of people have too. Yeah. And if you're thinking about becoming a pilot, I think now you know what to do.
Yes.
And of course, you need to follow Terry's blog and learn a little bit more there as as well.
Yes. It's been such a great pleasure. I'm obsessed with talking about the industry. I think if you are interested, my blog is on my Instagram page, which is @aviatrixterry. If this interview has been great, I'm so glad I came. Thank you so much for having me and choosing me as your pilot of choice.
Flying with Terry.
Yes. Yes.